Selamat pagi, Halina. Apa kabar?
Kabar baik, Anton.
Right. First, Indonesian, good morning, Indonesia with poetry. I'd like to say thank you very much for your time
You're welcome.
for this interview. We would love to hear when the first time you fell in love with Indonesia, which is the country itself, or the history behind it, the food, the people, the culture. Which one?
Yeah, well, when I was doing year 9, in history we did Asia and the Pacific. That was, our history theme. And this was in the early 60s, and Indonesia had become independent not much before that, 20 years perhaps. And I was fascinated, and I thought, this is so interesting that a country, we did China, and of course China is an old established culture, but then so is Indonesia. Yeah. And I couldn't understand how a country could be colonized, even though I knew that Australia had been colonized too. But, we had the stories, we sort of felt, or we thought we knew, that there weren't many Aboriginal people living here, that they were nomads, and we actually knew little about them. And I suppose it wasn't until afterwards, when I had already finished studying and been to Indonesia a few times, that I realized that that Australia had been colonized in much the same ways as other places. But, foreign powers were not interested in the country because, the British took it, the Dutch ignored it because they were busy in Indonesia, and they were interested in gold and the things that Indonesia had. Whereas here, you had to look for it, and it's and they weren't interested. The British took it because with the war in in America, which was the United States then, they had used it as a dumping ground for convicts, and but when the Americans demanded independence, they lost their place, and so they were looking for another place for convicts, and so they took this. But meanwhile, there was Indonesia to our north, and I first went there in 1964, and I don't know, I suppose I felt at home with the warmth of the people.
Right.
I went with a student group from Melbourne and Monash, and we were billeted with Indonesians, and usually university lecturers, and they were just so generous, because things were pretty tough in Indonesia in 1964.
Yes.
And but people were kind and went out of their way to look after us, and the students were good fun. It was a period when, in a way, Indonesia was trying to find an identity for itself, and the thing that appealed to me was Nasakon, nationalism and religion and communism, yeah. And I mean, you know, Indonesian communism wasn't exactly the same as Chinese
Yes.
or Russian communism.
Yes.
It was different, but, you know, it was, I think they were trying, and they were fighting hard to establish a nation because, you know, Indonesia had been made up of a number of different states, different areas, yeah?
Yes.
And that suited the Dutch because they didn't want a united Indonesia. They wanted to have these different groups, and that, so it was fascinating. And
Yes.
I've always been interested in politics, and that interested me, the fact that people were working to form a nation, basically. But then there was the culture, of course. I mean, you couldn't avoid it. It permeated people's lives, and the food, even though, I mean, the food was marvelous, but people were poor.
Yes.
You know, things were hard to come by because the government had stopped imports and didn't particularly encourage local production, you know, so that I can't remember going to a shop, but I know that when we got to Bali and I was staying with a family there, I met an Australian woman married to a Balinese, and she couldn't buy soap, you know. I mean, it was difficult to get things like that. And it was, but people shared and somehow made do, yeah. And
Right.
but for some people, having a bowl of rice and chilies, that was it.
Yes.
You know, so it's,
Yes.
it was tough, but the warmth of the people, the kindness, when they had so little themselves, yeah. But then there were others in Jakarta. I can't remember their name, but a family invited us to a party, and they were playing cassette, music on cassette, and, you know, they were doing the latest dances, and, you know, that I had never seen before. They were just so westernized, in
Right.
inverted commas, and they seemed to have no shortage of things. We didn't stay with them, you know, but somehow we met them, and they invited us to their house. But so, you know, but the warmth, the friendliness was all over.
Yes. So, I mean, what you're saying, I mean, it doesn't matter what, you know, layer of society they come from, the friendliness is struck you.
Yeah.
Yes. And then the culture. How did you explain? How do you explain the culture, the Borobudur, the Prambanan, Yogyakarta, you know, Sumatra, you know, that all in one, that you started falling in love with Indonesia?
Yeah, I suppose one of the things that I put down to that is that on Indonesian television, you know, they had segments showing different aspects of Indonesian life, and that, I think that helped. You know, people would sit in front of their televisions and say, "Oh, they do that in Papua. I didn't know that," and, you know, and so and that helped to unify the place. But it also engendered respect for other areas.
Yes.
And well, I suppose understanding. But I think people were, most people were working so hard to form a nation, you know, and it's, and I think Sukarno was anxious to form a united country.
Yes. I'm glad you mentioned Sukarno. I mean, without him, we could have been, delayed the independence, Sukarno and Hatta. How could you explain a bit of Sukarno? You mentioned about Sukarno. I mean, you went there the first time. Sukarno was still as president.
Yeah. Well, we went to hear his speech. We were actually staying in Senayan, and he gave a speech there, and it was his Ganyang Malaysia speech, and he knew we were there, I mean, well, there were two things. I thought his Indonesian was absolutely beautiful. The only other person whose Indonesian was so beautiful was Mokhtar Lubis.
Right.
And anyway, so I was fascinated by his speech, but also a bit scared because he talked about the older force, and that was us, the old forces, yeah. And was to us, we thought, because we ignored the Aborigines, we thought that we were a new nation, yeah. And so being regarded as an old force was a bit, well, surprising, but also this Ganyang Malaysia, because we knew that Australians were going to Malaysia, and so it was a little bit frightening, but it was still fascinating because the people we stayed with, no doubt some of them were supporters of Sukarno, but they didn't behave badly towards us, they were still warm and friendly and incredibly generous, yeah?
Yes,
so
yes.
There we are.
I think the Indonesian, when we in the West, when someone, asks you, how are you? If you said, you're not unwell, I'm not well. People don't really, take notice because, they have their own problem, I have a problem, But in Indonesia, if you're sick, you're unwell, they will straight away say, did you go, have you seen your doctor? They really mean it, Now, you mentioned about Mukhtar Lubis. Could you say something about Mukhtar Lubis? He was, opposed Sukarno rule. Yeah?
Yes, he did. When I went to work in Indonesia, I worked in the social sciences department at UI, and that included journalism. And there was the head of the journalism school had the same office as I, well, you know how the system works. People come in when they have a class or they have to supervise a student or something, but otherwise the office is empty, people don't come and sit in the office the way we do it in schools here. Well, maybe in schools people do, but not at university. But anyway, I got to know Asagaf, and he had a relative working for Mokhtar Lubis, and at that time Mokhtar Lubis decided, he had a newspaper called Indonesia Raya, and he decided to do a weekend edition in English. And so Asagaf asked me if I would like to work on that. And, well, my as a volunteer, my pay was not, it was Indonesian rate of pay. And almost everybody had 2 or 3 jobs to make enough to live on. And some of them just never did. Some of them never made enough to live on. They depended on their relatives or friends or somebody. Anyway, so I was happy to take on this job. And I used to be picked up. I was staying at Rismarini, which is the women's hostel belonging to UE. That's still there, but it's absolutely empty. All this waste was anyway. UE isn't in Jakarta anymore. It's in outside Jakarta. Anyway, I used to be picked up and taken to Mokhtar Lewis's offices and do the translation. And one of the sort of most memorable things was I used to translate his editorials, which most of which he used to put in Indonesia there, but he'd select them and I'd translate them. And he said to me, you can translate my next book. And I was just so flattered, because, as I said, I thought his Indonesian was beautiful. But someone said, John McGlynn, actually, who started the Lontar Foundation, which translates Indonesian literature into English mainly, he said that he was told once that somebody who is translating a novel or a piece of writing should be a writer, him or herself. That say a civil engineer who is not a writer. Some civil engineers are writers, but a civil engineer translating a piece of literature is not much use, because he or she can't interpret things the way a writer can. But, that's a gross overgeneralization, because, as I said, there are civil engineers who are writers as well. So, anyway, but I was so touched and flattered that he was doing that. And then, as you said, he was anti-Sukarno, and there was another newspaper. Indonesia there was pretty popular.
Sinar Harapan.
No, it wasn't Sinar Harapan. It wasn't one of the church. It was another one.
Pedoman.
It may have been Pedoman,
yes,
but I really can't remember, so I don't want to say that it was. And Mokhtar Lubis had a personal sort of disagreement with the owner, editor of that newspaper, whatever it was.
Khalid Anwar. Rosian Anwar.
No, it wasn't, because I knew Rosian Anwar. I didn't personally, but I knew of him. And I knew Ruslan Abdul Ghani again, not personally, but it wasn't one of those people. I can visualize this person. He was but then Mokhtar Lubis was pretty big too. He was a big man,
BMD, No?
It could have been.
BMD.
Now that's a possibility, but I'm not saying that was so, because I just can't remember. Anyway, they were arguing, and Sukarno was supporting the other person, but as Mokhtar Lubis, Nasakom was my favourite song, but and the feeling behind it. But Mokhtar Lubis was staunchly anti-communist. He was just so anti-communist that it sort of, it surprised me and sort of shocked me, because here the Communist Party was irrelevant.
Yes.
I think, what's his name, Menzies wanted it banned, and there was a referendum, and people said no. And I think after this, the Communist Party had one member.
Yes.
It was something nothing. And again, I thought, all this, who cares? But, I know that people do. Anyway, and the argument got out of hand, and Mokhtar Rubus was jailed.
Yes.
And Indonesia there was closed down, and it hasn't reopened since. And of course, Mokhtar Rubus would be, he has died, but he would be pretty old.
Yes. So did you end up translating this book? No. Okay.
No, he didn't. At that time he didn't have a book. I think when he was jailed, he did do some writing. But
Okay.
I left. But then, when he said that I should translate his next book, I don't know how serious he was.
Right.
If Indonesia there had been still going, and I had been working there, maybe he would have asked me to do it. But,
Yeah.
Yeah,
what about now we move to the subject of MIA. What MIA stands for?
Museum of Indonesian Arts.
Right, okay. So since when? Now, how did you end up in a...
It's probably around 12 years old,
Right.
12 to 15 years old. We decided, we used to have volunteer meetings every now and then. And one of the things that we thought was that we had so many things that were given to us mainly. Some we bought, but, and even then, 15 years ago, we were getting old, or we felt we were getting old, and so what would happen to these things? And so we thought we'd establish a museum and and have exhibitions and,
Yes.
talks and things. We imagined that within a few months we would get a place, and have a museum, but we haven't. We haven't got a place. There's nobody we know who is, no doubt there are people who have buildings that they would be quite happy to have used
Yes.
and looked after, but we don't know them, and so we don't have a place. We're getting older. Some of us feel that we can't continue much longer doing the jobs we're doing. We're particularly anxious to have a replacement treasurer who has worked out a system. Diraji was actually a librarian, but he was interested and he took the job on, and he worked out a system that works. But if we get we must get another
Yes.
treasurer.
I'm sure that someone would take over the...
This person can work out a system for him or herself.
Yes.
And we don't have, before we have an exhibition, we usually have 2 a year. Before we have an exhibition, there's a fair bit of work to do, but the rest of the time there isn't all that much to do. To be on the committee is to have an interest in Indonesia. That's the basis. I keep saying, well, it's the Museum of Indonesian Arts. It's not the Museum of Icelandic Arts, because Indonesia is our closest Asian neighbour. Australia was one of the colonial powers in Papua New Guinea. So it's not, Papua New Guinea is probably closer to us, but of the non sort of close Pacific places, Indonesia is our closest neighbor.
Yes, from Darwin to Kupang, only 500 K. So the closest point, from Australia, Indonesia. And also, you mentioned about culture. I talked to Tim Lindsay once, I said, why are you so, in love, love Indonesia so much? And he said, cultures, very rich in cultures. Officially, according to Wikipedia, 468 dialects, more than 100 languages. And Jaya Suprana, musician, said, when it comes to music, Indonesia, very, very rich. Now, the question is, to find someone to take over leadership of the MIA. I'm sure what won't be that difficult. You know why? Because MIA is a very famous. What you did, what you've been doing about Indonesia in MIA is very famous. You are the second Australian woman who been awarded Congen, first Margaret Cartoni. You're what year? 2021?
Yeah.
That's right. So the government, all Indonesian people appreciate what you've done. You've been doing, for many, many years. So I'm sure someone will be interested to take over, the torch.
Well, I'm hoping so, and I just wish they would put up their hand now, because, like Din, the treasurer, working out a system that is not set in stone. It can be changed. This person who takes over from him can set up his or her own system, and that goes for me, and that goes for all the committee members. Nothing is sort of set in stone.
Static, yeah.
But we have to have a takeover period. This new person who's interested has to put forward ideas. If we don't have 2 exhibitions a year and sort of open house talks, then we're not doing anything. But this new person might decide to have 3 exhibitions a year, but for that you need money. And so, but our members are generous, but we can't, unless we get a grant, it's difficult for us to have more than 1 exhibition without a grant.
Right.
Because places are expensive. But again, if we could find a place that we would look after, and it wouldn't be, again, if someone gave us a place, it wouldn't be a permanent gift. They would still be the owners, and they're giving it to us, leasing it to us for us to look after. But if in 20 years' time they decide that they want it back, well, obviously it belongs to them. Yeah.
Right. How did you feel when you were awarded this Consulate General Award in 2021? How did feel? Could you tell us
short? I couldn't believe it, because I feel that it's we don't. What we do gives us pleasure. It's one of the things that I like is when we have an exhibition and we have visitors, and they say, "Oh, I'm an Indonesian and I have never seen this before." And I think, well, museums are educational institutions, and us, or the majority of people on the committee, are ex-teachers, and with teachers we want to educate people. And one of the sad things now is that an awful lot of places that used to teach Indonesian no longer do so, yeah? And I can't understand why, because Indonesia hasn't moved. It's still there. It's in the same place. And I know that we're moving a certain distance, but we're moving northward. You know, we're not going south, we're going north. You know, this is... and the people in Indonesia will probably more speak excellent English than used to. They still speak Indonesian, and little old ladies in a village don't speak English, and you know, some of them no doubt do. If they were Dutch educated, they probably do speak English, but there aren't all that many left anymore, because the Dutch have gone, you know, more than, no, not 100 years ago. They officially left in 1950, yeah, so 73 years ago.
But the last question, what message you want to say to young Indonesian or young Australian about arts? Yeah.
Join Mia and enjoy the art and culture of Indonesia.
Terima kasih Halina, dan sampai nanti ya.